Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're going to be talking about Visual Studio subscriptions. Everything about how to license them, how to use them properly within those licensing rights, which Visual Studio subscription is the best one to suit your needs in whatever role you are, and talking about return on investment and why you should be using Visual Studio subscriptions for dev test workloads. My name is Paul LaBerge and I'm a senior specialist at Microsoft, focused on developer productivity. I hope you enjoy this video. Okay, so let's get through this. So Microsoft and GitHub have always been at the forefront of development tools and platforms. And one of the goals of these teams building these platforms is to help developers be as productive as possible using tools that they love. And this continues onwards today, both with Visual Studio and with GitHub. But we're going to focus mainly on Visual Studio here today. So with that, if you've used Visual Studio before, or if you're using it today, you probably already know this. And if you aren't using Visual Studio, then you may already know this as well because it is so pervasive within the software development community. In the fact of the matter is, Visual Studio helps you build software that adds value to both customers, to yourselves, all those types of things, right? It targets any platform, whether it's in the cloud or on premises, in using any language, which might be a little surprising to some of you, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Ultimately, if you're building software, Visual Studio and the subscriptions associated with it are probably things that you should be thinking about. So when you talk about the Visual Studio family of products and services, there's a number of different sort of options that you have here. So on the left-hand box that you can see here are all the different sort of Visual Studio products, including Visual Studio Enterprise, Visual Studio Professional, Visual Studio Test Professional, MSDN platforms, and Visual Studio Code. So Visual Studio Code we're not going to talk an awful lot about, but that's basically a free code editor that is very, very popular in the development community today. But it doesn't contain some of the benefits that Visual Studio paid versions of that you see here as well, that have benefits. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And related to the Visual Studio family is GitHub and Azure DevOps, which are DevOps platforms that help you deliver great software and solutions, as well as Microsoft Azure, which is Microsoft's cloud for building custom applications. So together between these two different families, we have some great software and platforms that can help you build out the best solutions for you, for your customers, or for your organization. So why should you use Visual Studio? Well, first of all, it makes you be productive. So if you've used Visual Studio before, like I mentioned, you'll know already that Visual Studio is a very productive platform that has basically all the tools necessary for you to build software, to understand the software development process and how your code is working. But in addition to that, it also provides you with the ability to have benefits, and those benefits include the ability to use DevOps platforms like the ones that we talked about. It also allows you to manage complexity, and everyone that's building software solutions today, whether you're a developer, a tester, an operations manager, or a business analyst, know that software becomes more complex over time, and that's certainly the case today. And also, regardless of who or what platform you're targeting, whether it's a cloud platform, whether it's a mobile device or a server or client application, you can build all those things with the Visual Studio suite of tools. So before we talk a little bit more about the types of subscriptions, let's talk about licensing, because I think it's really important to have a refresher on exactly what Visual Studio subscriptions give you and what rights you have with those. So we'll just get through that and then we'll talk about some of the benefits after. So Visual Studio subscriptions are an add-on, sometimes required add-on, sometimes optional add-on to Visual Studio. That provide you with tools and software that allow you to build your software in dev test environments at very low cost, for example. So we're going to talk an awful lot about what these things are, but Visual Studio subscriptions are very much a very important part of the Visual Studio experience that you may have as a developer or as a tester or as anybody that is part of a software delivery platform. So basically, Visual Studio subscriptions allow you to develop and test or demonstrate programs on dev test environments and evaluate things. But one of the things that you should make sure that you know is that if you're using the benefits that are included with Visual Studio subscriptions, you must have a Visual Studio subscription license or subscriptions assigned to you. So it's a named license. So basically, you can't share that license with others. So that's really important to understand. And there's a number of different sort of scenarios under which you would do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. It also gives you cloud use rights. So Visual Studio subscribers have the ability to make use of dev test environments at reduced rates of consumption charges in Microsoft Azure. And it also gives you a number of other sort of capabilities as well, which we'll talk about at a later time in this presentation. And as I said before, it's a per user model. You can't share these licenses across multiple users. It's named user, which means that you are given a Visual Studio subscription and it's tied to you, and you can't share that with others. And we'll talk a little bit about things like high watermark, but basically these Visual Studio subscriptions you can actually reassign to other users every 90 days. So you can't assign it to yourself for one day and then assign it to another person the other day. You basically have to wait 90 days. That's the way the licensing works. So one of the benefits of using Visual Studio subscription software is that it gives you an awful lot of software of the Microsoft platform. So this includes Windows, it includes SQL Server, it includes all the server software that you typically see, such as Exchange or SharePoint or Dynamics, those types of things. Those are benefits for use in dev test environments, and you can install those pieces of software at no additional charge for dev and test environments, not for production, but for dev and test environments. The stipulation with that, though, is that if you install a piece of software that is licensed under a Visual Studio subscription, you're required to make sure that everyone interacting with that environment has a Visual Studio subscription as well. Okay, this includes not only development on those different platforms, but also anyone who is installing and provisioning those solutions, anyone who is administering or configuring, managing those capabilities, running, viewing, or otherwise interacting with that environment. So that's really, really important to understand, because basically these are the stipulations of the license. There is one exception to this, and that's in the fine print that you see here. And that is basically the only exception to these rules is that anyone who is doing a user acceptance testing activity. So if the only thing that you are doing within this environment is user acceptance testing, so giving the thumbs up, thumbs down on whether a solution is ready to go to production or not, that is the only situation where a user does not require a Visual Studio subscription in a dev test environment if you're using dev test software. Okay. If you are doing anything that includes user acceptance testing, as well as those things that you see in the bullet points, for example, or developing or anything, then you will require a Visual Studio subscription associated with it. So how do you define a dev test subscription, or dev test environment, I should say? You can't use Visual Studio subscription software in a production environment. So in order to make sure that you're on board with that, you have to first rule out your environment as being a production environment. And there's a few ways to sort of identify this. So for example, and I'm going to go to the bullet points here as well, is that environments that connect to a production database. So if you're using production data within that dev test environment, that is not considered a dev test environment as far as Visual Studio subscriptions are concerned, and you cannot use Visual Studio subscription software associated with it. If you're doing a backup or disaster recovery scenario, that basically is meant to make sure that that dev test environment stays up and running and has a hot backup, for example, the backup component of that dev test environment cannot you cannot use Visual Studio subscription software, because that is a production use of a backup and disaster recovery standpoint for that specific dev test environment. And the environments that are sometimes used for production and sometimes not. So for example, if you have a performance testing environment that you sometimes switch to production depending on how you sort of set up your deployment strategies, anything that is considered production even for a momentary period of time cannot be licensed using Visual Studio subscription software. And all of this is managed and detailed under the Visual Studio licensing white paper, which you can see the link at the bottom of this slide. The other thing that we should talk about, and I mentioned this earlier, but high watermark definition. So when you purchase Visual Studio subscriptions as part of your Visual Studio licenses that you have within your organization, there is this concept of high watermark. And basically what this means is, say for example, your organization buys 10 Visual Studio Enterprise licenses, okay? And you assign all 10 of these licenses to developers or people on your team that require access to that solution. If an 11th or 12th, for example, person installs Visual Studio Enterprise on their machine that do not already have a Visual Studio license, then that is considered the new high watermark, which means that you have an obligation to pay for 12 or 11, whatever it is that you actually went over the Visual Studio licenses that you had. Even if it's only for a day and then you basically uninstall it, that is now considered your new obligation. So that is something that when you get to renewals, you'll have to take into account as part of your obligation associated with that. So that's really important to understand. It doesn't go the other way. So say, for example, you buy 10 Visual Studio Enterprise licenses and you only use 8 and you have 2 that are free. You don't get a discount, or you don't get a refund on those two licenses. It's only if you actually go over what you've actually already purchased. So again, this is also part of the Visual Studio Subscription Administrator's Guide, which is linked to at the bottom of the slide as well. So that's it for licensing. So now what we need to do is give you some understanding of what Visual Studio subscription is the right fit for the role that you're in, for example. It's not always easy to understand. So I have some scenarios that we're going to talk about that give you a little bit of an understanding of what Visual Studio subscription fits into what sort of role, for example. So let's go through this. The first thing that we need to do is really understand, for example, what the different Visual Studio subscriptions are that are available. The top level one, and the one that contains everything that a Visual Studio subscription can offer, is included with Visual Studio Enterprise. So when you purchase Visual Studio Enterprise, it automatically comes with a Visual Studio subscription associated with it. You can't buy it without it. And it gives you everything under the sun. And we'll talk a little bit about what's included within a Visual Studio subscription in a bit. The next most popular one is actually the lowest SKU, or the cheapest SKU associated with Visual Studio, and that's Visual Studio Professional. Now you may notice that I've actually added Visual Studio Professional plus Visual Studio subscription. That's because you can purchase Visual Studio Professional without a Visual Studio subscription if you choose. But most organizations include the Visual Studio subscription with Visual Studio Professional because it gives you the benefits of the Visual Studio subscription. Without it, you don't get the benefits and you can't do dev test and things like that using dev test software. So that is something that is very important to understand. And if your organization is looking to purchase Visual Studio Professional, it's probably important to make sure that they're buying the Visual Studio subscription alongside of it as well. MSDN Platforms is, for all intents and purposes, it's basically the Visual Studio subscription that comes with Visual Studio Enterprise. But the difference between Visual Studio Enterprise and MSDN Platforms is that MSDN Platforms does not include the development tools. So the Visual Studio Integrated Development Environment is not included in MSDN Platforms. And then the final one is Visual Studio Test Professional. And Visual Studio Test Professional is equivalent to the Visual Studio subscription that you would add on to Visual Studio Professional. But it also gives you some testing tools that are included with Azure DevOps. So if you're a tester, for example, and you're using Azure DevOps, and you want to use the test plan capability within Azure DevOps, the Visual Studio Test Professional is a license that can help you out with that. So this is an eye chart, and I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but you're more than welcome to pause the video if you want to take a look at it. But basically, these are the side-by-side comparisons of the various different sort of subscriptions that are included with each of these Visual Studio SKUs. and it shows you exactly what you get with each. So as no surprise, like I mentioned before, Visual Studio Enterprise gives you everything under that Visual Studio subscriptions give you. But some of the other ones don't have everything, so you need to take a look and find out how that fits into what your role might be. Okay. So, speaking of roles, let's talk a little bit about personas and the different sort of use cases under which Visual Studio subscription might be appropriate. So the first set of roles that we'll talk about are developer roles, which is pretty commonly used within Visual Studio, as you might imagine. So the first one is I am a developer targeting Microsoft Azure. So if you're using Microsoft Azure, you can leverage your Visual Studio subscription to get dev test environment or subscription rates that are highly discounted from production rates. So this is a benefit of Visual Studio subscriptions that you will probably want to take advantage of if you're targeting Microsoft Azure. And in order to take advantage of that, you need a minimum of the Visual Studio Professional plus the Visual Studio subscription. So you need to make sure that Visual Studio subscription is tied to Visual Studio Professional. You may need a higher version, so it could be Visual Studio Enterprise or MSDN platforms potentially that you might need. But ultimately, you're going to need at least a Visual Studio subscription of sorts in order to take advantage of dev test rates within Microsoft Azure. If you're a senior developer with architectural responsibilities, you're probably going to want the architectural tools and some of the super user capabilities within Visual Studio Enterprise. And that's where basically I'm saying that if you are one of those types of people that needs access to those types of capabilities, Visual Studio Enterprise is probably the right subscription for you to make use of. If you are a developer that's focused only on solutions hosted on Windows and SQL Server, so for example, if you're building a web application hosted on Windows and it uses a SQL Server backend and you're not using any other Microsoft software associated with it, then the Visual Studio Professional plus Visual Studio subscription is probably the right role for you to make use of, okay, or a subscription to make use of. Because the Visual Studio subscription associated to Visual Studio Professional includes Windows and SQL Server software, and that's basically it from a software standpoint, so that would be appropriate. However, in the next row, you can see I'm a developer building solutions that targets all sorts of different types of Microsoft Server software, including SharePoint, Dynamics, etc., and you're basically targeting software hosted on Windows and SQL Server as well. You probably want to make use of Visual Studio Enterprise because you're probably going to be using the developer tools associated with that. And Visual Studio Enterprise gives you dev test software licenses for all those server software that I mentioned here, plus a few others as well. So that's where Visual Studio Enterprise might be important to you. Even if you're not a senior developer in architecture resource, you still might require that. The next role is if you are a non.NET developer. If you're doing C++, say for example, and you're not using Visual Studio for C++, if you're using Vim on a Linux platform or something like that, and you're basically building Java applications or whatever, and you're actually targeting those solutions on Windows or leveraging SQL Server alone, then you're probably fine with Visual Studio Professional plus Visual Studio subscription because that will give you everything that you need because you're not using any other server software except for Windows and SQL Server. The other flip side of that is if you're a non.NET developer, like I mentioned before in the previous row, and you're building solutions that are hosted on multiple Microsoft Server products like Dynamics or SharePoint, etc., MSDN platforms might be the right solution for you because it gives you access to all of that Microsoft Server software for dev and test, but it doesn't include the integrated development environment, so the Visual Studio software. Because if you're using, say, for example, Eclipse or IntelliJ for Java, or if you're just using Visual Studio Code for Python and you don't require the integrated development environment or whatever, MSDN platforms might be the right solution for you. Okay, so that's sort of some of the personas around developer roles. Let's move on to QA. So if you're talking about testers, and here are some of the ones. So like if you're in a QA role, testing solutions hosted in Microsoft Azure, again, the minimum requirement here would be Visual Studio Professional plus a Visual Studio subscription, similar to the reasons why I mentioned that in the previous slide around developers. because the Visual Studio subscription included with Visual Studio Professional is the entry level, and it gives you access to dev test rates for Microsoft Azure. If you're in a QA role that leverages or that you're testing for Windows or SQL Server based solutions, and you're using Azure DevOps test plans to do your testing, then Visual Studio Test Professional is the right solution for you, because it gives you the same Visual Studio subscription associated with Visual Studio Professional. But in addition to that, it gives you access to the Azure DevOps test plans capability, so that you have the ability to use those testing tools in that platform as well. So that's where Visual Studio Test Professional comes into play. The next one is if you're in a QA role testing solutions that use various multiple Microsoft Server products, again, this Dynamics, SharePoint, Exchange, etc., type of thing, you may want to use MSDN platforms. And the reason for that is that MSDN platforms gives you everything in the previous role, including Windows and SQL Server, as well as these other products now, as well as access to Azure DevOps test plans. So you have the ability to make use of that within MSDN platforms, and that is the minimum for that type of scenario that we're talking about there. And then if you are a developer and a QA resource leveraging Azure DevOps test plans, you would either need Visual Studio Enterprise or MSDN platforms, and that depends on the developer persona that you're making use of as well, right? So again, take a look at the developer persona slide in the previous slide to find out exactly what is the most appropriate. And then finally, from a QA perspective, if you're someone who accesses those environments strictly for purposes of user acceptance testing, and you're not doing anything else within that dev test environment, then you do not require any Visual Studio subscription. Okay, so this is the only exception to needing a Visual Studio subscription to access a dev test environment that has software licensed under Visual Studio subscriptions. All right, let's move on to IT professionals, so operational roles. So if you're an operations or sysadmin that manages Azure DevTest subscriptions, again, this whole idea, even though you might not be using the dev tools within Visual Studio Professional, it's the cheapest option for you to get access to dev test subscriptions within Microsoft Azure, and so therefore that might be the right one for you. If you're an operations or sysadmin that manages dev test environments that hosts only Windows and SQL Server, same idea. Visual Studio Professional plus a Visual Studio subscription is probably the right one for you to make use of. If you're in operations and you are managing dev test environments that use multiple different Microsoft Server products, again, SharePoint, Dynamics, etc., MSDN platforms is probably the right one for you, because this gives you the ability to access those server products, and you don't need the developer tools associated with it. Finally, if you're both a developer and a sysadmin, because many people wear many hats again, the minimum you would require would be Visual Studio Professional plus Visual Studio subscriptions. And that also depends on whether or not you are, what type of developer you are. And I would refer you back to a couple slides back where we talk about the developer personas to give you the type of version of the Visual Studio subscription that you require. So hopefully this sort of gives you a little bit more of an understanding of exactly the different types of roles and scenarios under which you would choose a specific Visual Studio subscription. All right, so now that we've gone through that, let's talk a little bit about the benefits that are included in the various different Visual Studio subscriptions. So every single one of these subscriptions gives you access to the software that I mentioned, right? So depending on the level, you either get Windows and SQL Server only, or you get everything that Microsoft provides from a Visual Studio subscription standpoint for server software, those types of things for dev test. It also gives you access to GitHub Enterprise, which we'll talk a little bit about in a bit, depending on the version of Visual Studio you're using. But all of them also give you access to Azure DevOps. So if you're using Azure DevOps, this might be a good option, a nice benefit for you to make use of, because it gives you at least basic access to Azure DevOps, and in some cases, specifically everything except for Visual Studio Professional gives you access to the test plans as well. All right. There are also Azure benefits. So I talked a little bit about DevTest in Azure, but there's a few other sort of benefits within Azure that a Visual Studio subscriber gets as well. One are the individual credits. So basically, a Visual Studio subscriber can light up their own personal Azure subscription. And that Azure subscription gives you credits every month. So you can sort of see here the different sort of credit values that you get based on the different sort of Visual Studio subscription versions that you have. And this is basically a use it or lose it type of benefit. So basically what happens is that you get a certain number of credits per month. And if you only use 50% of those credits, it doesn't roll over to the next month, but you basically resets itself every month. And you also get credits for as long as you have the Visual Studio subscription. If you go over those credits, you'll have to pay by credit card, but you can also, by default, it actually caps it so that it won't go to credit card automatically, so that you don't have any overages unless you choose to. It also gives you access to dev test rates, which we'll talk a little bit about in the next few slides. But basically, it's a nice benefit for team-based development. Visual Studio Professional and Visual Studio Enterprise also give you the ability to have a free step up to GitHub Enterprise as well. So if you're interested in using GitHub Enterprise for your dev test and DevOps capabilities, those two SKUs of Visual Studio give you access to GitHub Enterprise. And once you have GitHub Enterprise, you also have access to a number of other pieces of software that you can add on from a paid perspective. One is GitHub Advanced Security. Another one is GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps. So if you're using Azure DevOps, you can use Advanced Security, which is basically the premier code security tool for developers. And then you also have access to step up and add on a paid version, a subscription for GitHub Copilot for Business, which is an AI paired programming tool that allows you to sort of put your code onto hyperspeed, because it actually does some of the coding for you, which is really nice. There are additional tooling benefits, including Microsoft 365. So if you have a Visual Studio Enterprise or Professional SKU, you actually get a dev test tenant for Microsoft 365, so that you can do some testing on Microsoft 365 as well. And then Visual Studio Enterprise and MSDN Platforms also gives you a production license of Power BI Pro, which is nice. Each of the Visual Studio subscriptions give you training benefits to the different sort of training companies that you see here as well. Depending on your Visual Studio SKU, you get more or less depending on what it is. But all these are available as well. And if you're a developer or someone who does software delivery, you're probably familiar with at least some of these. And it gives you some great access to tools. You also get support benefits. So each Visual Studio subscription gives you access to technical support. So you can create a support ticket and get access to support through your Visual Studio subscriptions. You also have forums that are Microsoft product engineers of various different disciplines. They take a look at those forums and they answer questions within there, and that's specifically for Visual Studio subscribers. So if you have a question, you can ask it, and either someone from the community will answer, or one of our engineers. But this is something that's available. And if you have a non-technical question, so if you have a question around licensing or how you make provision a license for an individual within your organization, we also have a chat, and that chat allows you to get access to help on those types of questions as well. So I mentioned before that there was individual credit benefits for Azure that come with Visual Studio subscriptions, but there's also this something called an Azure EA, which stands for Enterprise Agreement Dev Test Offer. So basically, what this does is this allows your teams to leverage Azure for dev and test in a team format. So the credits that I talked about before were really for individuals. It's a sandbox for you to learn, to test things out yourself. But if you're doing team development, you're probably going to want the EA Dev Test offer instead. And Visual Studio subscriptions allow you access to those types of subscriptions. So it gives you the ability to work as a team, improve your quality. It also gives you the ability to build these hybrid solutions that are pretty common. So you have enterprise solutions that are both on premises and in Microsoft Azure. So it gives you the ability to do that for Dev Test as well. So basically, what does the EA Dev Test offer give you? It gives you discounted compute rates. Because you're doing things in Dev Test, your rates for consumed services are well below production rates. So for example, Visual Studio subscriptions give you access to that, and that could include things like virtual machines that are very discounted, as well as other services such as web apps. We also provide the ability to draw off the Azure commit. So as I mentioned in the previous, in one of the previous slides around those credits, if you go over your credits allotment for that month, you have to pay by credit card. The EA Dev Test offer does not do that. So basically what it does is it draws off of a commitment that your company has made to Microsoft for Azure spend. So basically there is no limit unless your company has created a limit within your subscription, which is pretty common as well, but basically you don't have to put in a credit card at any point. We also provide a virtual machine image gallery that includes Windows client virtual machines. So if you're not a Visual Studio subscriber, you don't have access or the rights to put a Windows 11 or Windows 10, for example, or any sort of supportive Windows client machine on Microsoft Azure or any other cloud. So this is something that Microsoft Azure provides to Visual Studio subscribers. And it gives you Dev Test licensing rights on Microsoft Azure as well. So the software that's included with the Visual Studio subscription is also included. You have rights to do that on Azure as well, which is nice. So just as an example of how these are sort of set up, your company creates a monetary commit to Microsoft Azure. That's the team workloads. And then basically as a enterprise agreement, Azure Enterprise Agreement administrator, if you are an administrator or if you know someone who is an administrator, she will basically create a subscription for you or for your team. And that subscription process basically allows you to create a production subscription, which is by default, or if there is a checkbox in the subscription creation process that allows you to create a non-production subscription, which is basically this Dev Test offer. And then at that point, basically you make use of your resources and you do your Dev Test at that point. So it's actually very flexible from that perspective. Why would you do this? Well, it's the best of both worlds. You get one bill for both your Dev Test and your production workloads. So as someone who may be in procurement that pays the bills, for example, the monetary commitment funds cover both these workloads, which is nice. Dev Test workloads are highly discounted, like I mentioned before. So you actually have a return on investment that is much more effective than you would have otherwise, which is kind of nice. And it gives you all the benefits that a Visual Studio subscription gives you with the EA Dev Test offer as well, which is nice. So in summary, let's talk a little bit about what it gives you. So Visual Studio subscriptions allow you to collaborate as a team. You can work as a team. It gives you the ability to make use of the best tools and best platforms in the business to build your software solutions and add value to your company or to your customers. And it does so in a way that allows you to do Dev Test in a very cost-effective way. So your return on investment is actually much more accelerated because of the fact that you are paying less for what you would be doing otherwise and using production-based software for Dev and Test. So definitely worthwhile. So I hope you found this interesting, useful. Here are some reference materials that you can make use of as well. So this is also available to you as part of this. So definitely take a look at those if you have any other further questions. And I thank you for your time. I hope you have a great day and happy coding. Take care.